Every parent's worst nightmare is watching their child suffer and being unable to stop it. But what happens when a father does see it happen, and he has the power to do something about it? In the frontier town of Redemption Creek, 3 drifters made a terrible mistake. They cornered a young girl outside the general store and struck her down, laughing as she fell to the dust. They didn't know her father was watching from across the street. Jacob Stone was a mountain man who'd survived alone in the wilderness for years, and they'd just hurt the only person he loved. What happened next became a legend told around campfires for generations. Would justice be swift, or would something far more terrifying unfold? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory in 1878 was a land of dust and dreams, where men came to remake themselves and often found they couldn't escape what they'd been. Redemption Creek sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, a town of maybe 300 souls who'd chosen this hard life over whatever they'd left behind. The buildings were mostly wood, weathered gray by wind and sun, and the main street turned to mud when it rained, and to choking dust when it didn't. Jacob Stone had arrived 6 months earlier with his daughter Emma, driving a wagon loaded with furs and supplies. He'd bought a small cabin on the edge of town with cash, asked no questions, and made it clear he expected the same courtesy. The townspeople had learned to respect his silence. There was something in his eyes that suggested asking about his past would be unwise. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders and thick through the chest, with hands that looked like they could break stone. His face was weathered and lined, a thick beard showing streaks of gray, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds. He moved with the careful economy of someone who'd spent years in places where a wasted step could mean death. When he walked down the street, people noticed, not because he sought attention, but because he carried himself like a force of nature, something that demanded acknowledgement simply by existing. Emma was 12 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark hair and delicate features. She wore it in a single braid, tied with a faded blue ribbon, and she had a quiet way about her that made adults want to protect her. She helped her father with chores, studied her letters with the town's schoolteacher, and never complained about their simple life. In the evenings, she would sit on their cabin porch and read, while Jacob worked on his endless projects, repairing tools or treating hides. The relationship between father and daughter was evident in small gestures. The way he would place his hand on her shoulder when they walked together, how she would lean against him when they sat watching the sunset. They didn't speak much, but their silence was comfortable, the kind that comes from deep understanding. Martha Henderson owned the general store, a sturdy woman in her 50s with kind eyes and flour permanently dusted on her apron. She'd taken a liking to Emma, often giving her small tasks in exchange for peppermint sticks or ribbons. Martha was one of the few people Jacob spoke to beyond basic transactions, and even then, their conversations were brief. "Your daughter is a sweet girl," Martha had told him once while he was buying supplies. "She is," Jacob had replied, and the weight he put on those 2 words suggested volumes left unsaid. Sheriff Tom Garrett was pushing 60, a man who'd worn the badge for 30 years and was tired in his bones. He'd seen the territory change from wild frontier to something approaching civilization, though he'd be the first to admit they still had a long way to go. He was competent enough when dealing with drunks and petty theft, but he knew his limitations. When real trouble came to town, he often found himself wishing for younger legs and faster hands. Reverend Samuel Walsh ran the small church at the north end of town, a gentle man who believed in redemption and second chances, sometimes to a fault. He tried several times to engage Jacob in conversation about faith and salvation, but Jacob had politely deflected each attempt. Still, Emma attended Sunday services regularly, and Jacob would wait outside, leaning against the church wall, never complaining about the time. The town had its rhythms. Mornings were for work, the sound of hammers and saws mixing with the lowing of cattle and the calls of merchants opening their shops. Afternoons brought a brief respite from the heat, people retreating to shade and cool drinks. Evenings were social, folks gathering on porches or in the saloon, sharing news and gossip. It was a hard life, but an honest one, and most people seemed content with that trade. Jacob had a reputation, though no one could quite articulate what it was based on. He'd never raised his voice, never started a fight, never made threats. But there were stories. A man had tried to cheat him on a fur trade once, and Jacob had simply looked at him, just looked with those storm cloud eyes, and the man had immediately offered fair price and apologies. A horse had gone wild in the street, nearly trampling a child, and Jacob had stepped forward and calmed the animal with his hands and voice. Movements so confident they bordered on supernatural. "He's been places," was how the blacksmith described him. "Done things. You can see it in how he moves. Mountain man through and through," the banker agreed. "Probably lived alone up there for years." Those types either go crazy or become something else entirely. Stone's the second kind. What no one knew was that Jacob carried a hunting knife on his belt, the handle carved from a grizzly bear's claw. He'd made it himself 7 years earlier, after a 3-day ordeal in the high country where he'd fought off a massive bear with nothing but a broken rifle and his bare hands. The scars on his arms and chest told that story, though he never showed them and never spoke of it. The knife was a reminder that survival often came down to will and the willingness to do what was necessary. Emma knew about the knife. She'd watched him carve the handle, had held his hand while Martha's predecessor, an old woman named Agnes, had sewn up the worst of the wounds. She'd been 5 years old and hadn't cried, though she'd been terrified. Her father had smiled at her through the pain and said, "Sometimes life tests us, little one. What matters is we don't quit." That morning, like every morning, they'd risen with the sun. Jacob had made breakfast while Emma fed their 2 chickens and gathered eggs. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that speaks of deep bond rather than absence of words. After breakfast, Emma had helped wash the dishes, and Jacob had reminded her to be careful in town. "Stay where people can see you," he'd said, as he did every time she left the cabin. "I will, Papa," she'd replied. Kissing his bearded cheek, he'd watched her walk down the path toward town, her blue ribbon catching the morning light, and he'd felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came from loving something so completely that the thought of losing it was unbearable. The 3 drifters had arrived 2 days earlier, riding in at dusk like they owned the world. The leader was a man called Colt Travers, lean and dangerous-looking, with a tied-down pistol and eyes that never stopped moving. His companions were Billy Moss, younger and nervous, always looking to Colt for direction, and Frank Denton, who people already called Snake for the way he moved and the coldness in his stare. They'd taken rooms above the saloon and immediately made themselves unwelcome. Loud, crude, treating the townspeople with open contempt. Sheriff Garrett had spoken to them once, asked them to keep the peace, and Colt had smiled and said all the right words while his eyes promised violence. The sheriff had walked away, knowing trouble was coming, but unsure what to do about it. Jacob had noticed them immediately. He had marked them as predators the moment he'd seen them. He'd made sure Emma knew to avoid them, to cross the street if she saw them coming, to never be alone where they might find her. She'd nodded seriously, understanding the weight in her father's voice, even if she didn't fully understand the danger. But on this particular morning, as Emma walked toward the general store to help Martha with inventory, she was thinking about the book she was reading, a story about knights and castles that Reverend Walsh had lent her. She was thinking about honor and bravery, about heroes who protected the innocent. She wasn't thinking about 3 drifters who'd been drinking since breakfast and were looking for entertainment. Jacob was across the street at the blacksmith's, discussing repairs to a wagon wheel when he saw the 3 men step out of the alley beside the general store. Saw them spot Emma, saw the way Colt nudged his companions and smiled. Every instinct Jacob possessed screamed warning. He started moving, but he was too far away, and the street was crowded with morning traffic. He saw Emma notice the men, saw her hesitate, saw her try to cross the street as he'd taught her, but Colt moved faster, blocking her path. Billy and Snake spread out, forming a triangle that trapped her. Jacob was running now, shoving through people, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw Colt say something that made Emma step back, saw Snake reach for her braid, saw her pull away, and then he saw Colt's knee come up, fast and brutal, catching Emma full in the face. Time seemed to fracture. Jacob saw his daughter's head snap back, saw blood spray from her nose, saw her small body crumple to the dust like a puppet with cut strings, saw her school slate shatter on the ground, chalk rolling into the street, saw the blue ribbon torn from her hair, landing in a small pool of her blood, and he saw the three men laugh. The sound that came from Jacob's throat was not quite human. It was something primal, a sound from the deepest part of him, where civilization hadn't reached, where a father's protective instinct lived raw and untamed. People would talk about that sound for years afterward, how it made their blood run cold, how it seemed to come from the earth itself. He was still 30 yards away when Emma hit the ground. 30 yards that might as well have been 30 miles. He watched her small body fold, watched her hands try to break her fall, watched her land hard on her side with her face already streaming blood. The slate she'd been carrying shattered beneath her, and the pieces scattered like a broken innocence across the dusty street. Colt Travers stood over her, laughing. He turned to his companions, arms spread wide, as if he'd accomplished something worthy of celebration. "Did you see that? Little thing went down like a sack of grain." Billy Moss was laughing too, but there was uncertainty in it, a nervous edge that said maybe this had gone too far. Snake Denton just smiled, cold and reptilian, already looking around for the next bit of entertainment. The street had gone quiet. People had stopped what they were doing, frozen by the sudden violence. A woman gasped. A man started forward, then stopped, unsure. This was the frontier, where violence was common enough, but there were lines you didn't cross. Hurting a child was one of them. Jacob moved through the crowd like water flowing downhill, inevitable and unstoppable. People parted without conscious thought, some ancient instinct telling them to get out of the way. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes burned with something that made grown men look away. He'd left the blacksmith's hammer he'd been examining on the ground behind him. Hands empty, but curled into fists that looked capable of breaking bone. Martha Henderson burst from her store, saw Emma on the ground and cried out. She started to rush forward but saw Jacob coming and froze. Later, she would tell people that she'd seen death walking in broad daylight, that she'd known with absolute certainty that someone was about to die. Emma was trying to sit up, one hand pressed to her face, blood streaming between her fingers. She was making small sounds of pain and confusion, the kind that tore at every protective instinct Jacob possessed. Her dress was covered in dust, her braid had come undone, and that blue ribbon lay in the dirt, soaked with her blood. Jacob reached the alley mouth and stopped. The three drifters hadn't noticed him yet, too busy with their entertainment. Colt was saying something about teaching town brats respect, and Snake was suggesting they find another one to play with. Billy had finally stopped laughing, was looking at Emma with something that might have been regret. "That's my daughter," Jacob said. His voice was quiet, barely above a conversational tone, but it cut through the noise of the street like a knife through silk. The three men turned, and for just a moment, none of them understood the danger they were in. Colt looked Jacob up and down, taking in the size of him, the way he stood, the absolute stillness that marked him as something more than an ordinary townsman. But Colt had faced down hard men before, had killed 3 men in gunfights and countless others in ways less formal. He wasn't easily intimidated. "Your daughter needs to learn some manners," Colt said, hand dropping casually to rest on his pistol grip. "Didn't move fast enough when her betters told her to." Jacob took one step forward. Just one, but the quality of movement made Snake's hand twitch toward his own weapon. This was how dangerous animals moved, with absolute economy and purpose. "You're going to apologize to her," Jacob said. "Not a request, not a demand, just a simple statement of what was going to happen." Colt laughed, but it sounded forced. "The hell I am." "Who do you think you are, mountain man?" "I'm her father," Jacob repeated, and this time there was something in his voice that made Billy Moss take an involuntary step backward. And you hurt her. Snake moved then, trying to flank Jacob, get an angle. But Jacob's eyes flicked to him for just a fraction of a second, and Snake stopped. There was a calculation happening, some wordless communication between predators. And Snake didn't like the math he was coming up with. Sheriff Garrett came running up the street, hand on his pistol, but not drawing it. He was breathing hard, face flushed with exertion and fear. He'd heard that inhuman sound Jacob had made, had seen the mountain man moving through the crowd, and knew with sick certainty that he was about to witness either a murder or a miracle. "Jacob," the sheriff said, voice tight. "Jacob, don't do this. They hurt Emma," Jacob said, not taking his eyes off the three drifters. "I saw. I'll handle it." Garrett stepped between Jacob and the drifters, though his body language said he'd rather be anywhere else. "I'll arrest them. They'll answer for this, will they?" Jacob's voice was flat. "You'll lock them up for a few days? Find them, then what? They ride out and do this to someone else's daughter? That's how the law works, Jacob. You know that." For the first time, Jacob's eyes moved from the drifters to the sheriff, and Garrett actually flinched. "The law," Jacob said softly, "doesn't seem to be working very well." Behind him, Martha had reached Emma and was helping her sit up, pulling a handkerchief from her apron to press against the girl's bleeding nose. Emma's eyes found her father through her tears, and she tried to speak but could only manage a sob. That sound, that small, broken sound from his daughter, nearly shattered Jacob's control. His hands trembled, and for a moment everyone could see the violence that lived inside him, struggling to break free. He took a deep breath, another, forcing himself back from the edge. "You have until sundown," Jacob said to the three drifters, his voice level again but somehow more frightening for its calmness. "Pack your things and ride out. Don't come back." Colt's hand was still on his pistol. "And if we don't?" Jacob smiled, and it was the most terrible thing anyone in that street had ever seen. There was no humor in it, no warmth. It was the smile of something that had stopped pretending to be civilized. "Then I'll kill you," he said simply. "All three of you. And I'll make sure you suffer first." "That's a threat," Garrett said quickly. "Jacob, that's a direct threat." "I can't let that stand." "It's not a threat," Jacob replied, still looking at Colt. "It's a promise." The tension hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. The entire street was watching now, 24 people holding their breath, waiting to see if blood would spill. Colt's fingers were white on his pistol grip, and Jacob hadn't moved, but everyone could feel the violence hovering between them like a living thing. It was Billy who broke first. "Come on, Colt," he said, voice shaking slightly. "Let's just go." "It's not worth it." "Shut up," Colt snapped, but some of the certainty had left his voice. He was used to intimidating people, used to backing them down with reputation and swagger. But Jacob Stone wasn't backing down, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Snake spat in the dirt. "We don't run from threats." "You should," Martha called out, still kneeling beside Emma. Her voice was sharp with anger and fear. "You should run as far and fast as you can, because that man has survived things that would kill normal men 10 times over. You hurt his daughter. His only daughter. The only thing he loves in this world. If you stay in this town, he will end you." Colt looked at Martha, then back at Jacob, doing the calculation. 3 against 1 should be good odds, but something about the mountain man's stillness made those odds feel uncertain. And there was the sheriff to consider, and the townspeople who were watching with hard eyes, clearly on Jacob's side. "We paid for our rooms through the week," Colt said finally, trying to salvage some pride from the situation. "We'll leave when we're good and ready." "Sundown," Jacob repeated. "After that, I stopped being reasonable." He turned his back on them then, which was either the bravest or most foolish thing he could have done. But he was moving toward Emma, and nothing else mattered. He knelt beside her, his big hands gentle as he took her face and tilted it up to examine the damage. Her nose was broken, blood still flowing freely, and her left eye was already starting to swell. She'd have bruises for weeks, and the sight of them on her delicate face made something cold and hard settle in Jacob's chest. "Papa," she whispered through the blood and tears. "It hurts. I know, little one. I know." He lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. Blood soaked into his shirt, but he didn't notice. "Martha, I need your help." "Of course," Martha said immediately. "Bring her inside. I have clean water and bandages." As Jacob carried Emma toward the store, Sheriff Garrett stepped in front of the three drifters. "You need to go, now!" Colt's face was dark with rage. "We're not done here." "Yeah," Garrett said quietly. "You are. You just don't know it yet." "That man in there? He's been nothing but polite and peaceful since he came to this town. Keeps to himself, causes no trouble, raises his daughter right. And you just hurt the only thing he cares about. If you're smart, you'll be on horses and riding before the sun sets." "Old man," Snake said, voice dripping contempt, "you'd best step aside before you get hurt." Garrett didn't move. "I'm going to give you some advice, and you should listen carefully. I've been wearing this badge for 30 years. I've seen hard men, dangerous men, killers and thieves and everything in between. And I'm telling you right now that Jacob Stone is something different, something worse. There's a violence in him that he keeps locked down tight, but you just gave him a reason to let it loose. If you stay, he will come for you. And your guns won't help, your numbers won't help, and I won't be able to stop him." He paused. "Let that sink in. So you can leave now with your pride dented, or you can stay and leave in pine boxes. Your choice?" The three drifters exchanged looks. Colt's jaw was clenched so tight his teeth hurt. But he could see the fear in Billy's eyes, the calculation in Snake's. They outnumbered one man, but somehow that didn't feel like enough. "We'll leave when we're ready," Colt said again, but it sounded hollow. He turned and stalked toward the saloon, his companions following. But all three of them kept glancing back over their shoulders, as if expecting Jacob to come charging after them. Inside Martha's store, Jacob sat Emma on the counter, while Martha brought water and clean cloth. The girl's face was a mess of blood and tears, and Jacob's hands shook as he began carefully cleaning the wounds. He'd field-dressed knife wounds and set broken bones out in the wilderness, but this was different. This was his daughter's pain, and it cut deeper than any blade. "Is it bad, Papa?" Emma asked, voice small. "You'll heal," he said, but his voice was rough. "Your nose is broken. There will be bruising, but you're strong. You'll get through this." Martha worked beside him, her practiced hands more skilled at this kind of care. "She'll need rest. Cold compresses for the swelling. And Jacob," she paused, met his eyes. "Those men won't leave." "I know. Then you know what's coming." "I know," he said again, softer this time. Emma reached up and touched his face with her small, blood-stained hand. "Don't let them hurt you, Papa. Promise me." He couldn't make that promise, so he said nothing. Just held her hand against his cheek and closed his eyes, letting himself feel the full weight of what had been done to her, what was coming, what he would have to become. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Redemption Creek held its breath. Waiting for sundown, Jacob carried Emma home as the sun reached its zenith, her weight light in his arms, but heavy in his heart. She'd stopped crying but held onto him tightly, one small hand gripping his shirt. People watched from windows and doorways as they passed, their faces showing sympathy mixed with fear, understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their quiet town. The cabin felt different when they entered, as if the violence that had happened in town had followed them home and settled into the corners like dust. Jacob laid Emma gently on her bed, a simple frame he'd built himself with a mattress stuffed with prairie grass and covered with quilts his wife had sewn before she died. Mary, the thought of her hit him like a physical blow. She'd been gone 3 years, taken by fever in the winter of 1875, and there hadn't been a day since that Jacob hadn't felt the absence of her. She'd been his anchor, the thing that kept him connected to civilization and humanity. Without her, he sometimes felt himself drifting back toward the savage he'd been before they met. He went to the small shelf where he kept his medical supplies, such as they were. A tin of salve made from bear grease and herbs he'd gathered in the high country, bandages torn from old shirts, willow bark for pain. The tin was battered and dented, marked with scratches from years of use in the wilderness. He'd mixed this batch the previous summer, had used it on his own cuts and scrapes, but now he held it like it was precious beyond measure, because it would ease his daughter's suffering. Emma watched him with eyes that looked too old for her 12 years. The left one was swollen nearly shut now, purple bruising spreading across her cheek. Her nose had stopped bleeding, but it sat crooked on her face, and Jacob knew it would never look quite the same. "Tell me a story, Papa," she said quietly. "Like you used to when I was little." Jacob sat on the edge of her bed, opening the tin of salve. The smell of it filled the small room, sharp and medicinal. "What kind of story?" "The one about how you and Mama met." His hands paused. He hadn't told that story in years, but looking at his daughter's bruised face, seeing her trying to be brave despite her pain, he found himself wanting to remember when things had been good. "Your mother was a school teacher," he began, gently applying the salve to Emma's swollen face. "This was in Colorado, a mining town called Silver Creek. I'd come down from the mountains to trade furs, planning to buy supplies and head back up before the next snow. And you saw her," Emma prompted. Though she knew the story by heart. "I saw her," Jacob confirmed. "She was standing outside the schoolhouse, ringing a bell to call the children in from recess. She had dark hair like yours, and when she smiled, it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds." He finished with the salve and began wrapping clean bandages gently around Emma's head, creating a support for her broken nose. His hands were steady now, focused on the task, but his voice carried a weight of old grief. "I stood there watching her for what must have been 5 minutes, just watching her smile and talk to the children. And I remember thinking that I'd spent so long in the wild that I'd forgotten what goodness looked like, what innocence looked like. She reminded me that there was more to life than just surviving." "She thought you were scary at first," Emma said, the hint of a smile on her swollen lips. "She did," Jacob agreed. "I looked like I do now, only wilder. Longer beard, rougher clothes, probably smelled like bear and wood smoke. When I finally worked up the courage to speak to her, she actually took a step back. But then you smiled, but then I smiled," Jacob said. "And your mother always said that changed everything. Said she saw past the rough exterior to something worth knowing." He finished with the bandages and helped Emma lie back on her pillow, pulling the quilts up around her. She looked so small, so fragile, and the rage that had been building in him since he'd seen her struck down threatened to break free again. "Papa," Emma said softly. "Those men, are they going to leave?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment. He'd never lied to his daughter, had always believed she deserved honesty, even when the truth was hard. "I don't think so." "Then what happens?" "I don't know yet, but he did know. Deep down, in the part of him that had survived alone in the wilderness for years before Mary had civilized him, he knew exactly what was going to happen. The question wasn't if he would act, but when, and how much of himself he was willing to sacrifice to protect his daughter. "Your mother made me promise something," Jacob said, and his voice had gone rough. "When she was dying, when the fever had her and we both knew she wasn't going to recover, she made me promise to take care of you, to raise you right, to give you a peaceful life away from violence." Emma's good eye watched him carefully. "Are you going to break that promise?" "I don't know how to keep it, and also keep you safe. Those men, they're not going to stop. They'll come back, and next time it might be worse. And if I do nothing, they'll think they can do whatever they want. To you, to anyone." He stood up, moving to the window. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down on their small plot of land. The chickens pecked in the dirt. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and eternal. It all looked so peaceful, but Jacob could feel the violence coming like a storm on the horizon. "I never told you much about my life before your mother," he said, still looking out the window. "I never wanted you to know that part of me." "You can tell me now," Emma said. "I'm not a child anymore." Today proved that. Jacob turned to look at her, and the truth of her words hit him hard. She wasn't a child anymore. Violence had stolen that from her, just as it had stolen so many things from so many people. She deserved to know who her father really was, what he was capable of, what he might have to become again. "I wasn't always a mountain man," he began. "I didn't grow up in the wilderness. I came from a town much like this one, had a family, went to school. But when I was 16, something happened. Raiders came through. They killed my parents, burned our farm. I survived by hiding, and that guilt, that shame of hiding while my family died, it changed something in me. He moved back to sit beside her bed. I spent the next 10 years living rough, learning to survive, becoming harder and meaner. I told myself I was preparing, so I'd never be helpless again. But really I was just running away from civilization, from people, from anything that reminded me of what I'd lost. Then you met Mama. Then I met your mother, Jacob said. And she saw something in me worth saving. Took me 3 months to convince her to even have dinner with me. But she finally agreed. And slowly, she showed me how to be a man again instead of just a survivor. She taught me that strength isn't just about what you can endure or what you can kill. It's about what you can build, what you can protect, who you can love. He took Emma's hand gently. When she died, I felt that old darkness trying to pull me back. But I had you, and I'd made her that promise. So I kept trying to be the man she wanted me to be. And now? Emma asked. Now those men have hurt you, and every instinct I have is screaming at me to hurt them back, to make them suffer, to make sure they never hurt anyone again. He closed his eyes. Your mother would tell me to let the law handle it, to trust in the sheriff, to be better than my worst impulses. But the law can't protect you if those men decide to come back. And I can't, his voice broke. I can't lose you too. Emma squeezed his hand with what strength she had. I don't want to lose you either. If you go after them, they might kill you. They might try. Papa, I'm scared. So am I, little one. So am I. They sat in silence for a while, father and daughter, both afraid of what was coming but unable to see any way around it. Outside, they could hear voices in the distance, the normal sounds of the town going about its business. But there was a tension underneath it all, as if everyone was waiting for something to break. A knock at the door made Jacob stand. He moved to answer it, his body between the door and Emma's bed, instinctively protective. When he opened it, Sheriff Garrett stood on the porch, his face lined with worry and exhaustion. Jacob, we need to talk. Come in. The sheriff entered, removed his hat, and glanced at Emma lying in her bed. His expression softened with sympathy before hardening again. I tried to run them out. Went to the saloon with my deputy, told them they needed to leave. They refused. I expected as much. Colt Travers is wanted in Colorado. 2 counts of murder, armed robbery, assault. I sent a telegram to the marshal's office. They're sending someone, but it'll be a week at least before they get here. Jacob shook his head. A week is too long, I know. But Jacob, if you go after them, if you hurt them, I'll have no choice but to arrest you. That's not a threat, it's just the reality of the situation. They can't have vigilante justice in my town, no matter how much they might deserve it. So what do you suggest? I wait for them to decide what to do next. Maybe they'll come here in the middle of the night. Maybe they'll catch Emma alone again. Maybe they'll hurt someone else's daughter. Garrett's face showed his frustration. I'm trying to find a middle ground here. There is no middle ground, Jacob said. Those men are predators. They understand strength, and they understand consequences. Words won't reach them. Laws won't stop them. The only language they speak is violence. Then let me deputize you. Make it legal. You can help me arrest them, and we can hold them until the marshal arrives. Jacob considered this. They won't come quietly, I know. People might get hurt, maybe killed. I know that too. But at least this way, you're acting under color of law. It gives you some protection. Before Jacob could answer, Emma spoke from her bed, her voice weak but clear. Papa, if the sheriff is asking for help, isn't that different from revenge? Both men turned to look at her. She'd pushed herself up on one elbow, her bandaged face pale but determined. If you're helping protect the whole town, not just punishing them for hurting me, doesn't that make it right? Out of the mouths of children, Jacob thought. She'd found the distinction he'd been struggling to articulate. Revenge versus protection, vengeance versus justice. It was a thin line, perhaps, but it was a line nonetheless. She's wise. Your daughter, Garrett said quietly. She gets that from her mother. Jacob looked at Emma for a long moment, then back at the sheriff. If I agree to this, I do it my way. I know these men, know their type. They won't be taken without a fight. I understand. And if it comes down to them or me, I'm choosing me. I'm choosing my daughter's future. You understand that? Garrett nodded slowly. I understand. Just try to give them a chance to surrender first. I will. But Tom, Jacob used the sheriff's first name for the first time since they'd met. You should know that I don't think they'll take it. Neither do I, Garrett admitted. But we have to try. For the sake of the town, for the sake of the law, we have to try. After the sheriff left, Jacob returned to Emma's bedside. She'd lain back down, but was watching him with those two old eyes. You're going to do it, she said. Not a question. I'm going to protect you. Protect the town. Whatever that takes. Promise me you'll come back. Jacob stroked her hair gently, careful not to disturb her bandages. I promise I'll do everything I can to come back to you. But Emma, if something happens to me, you need to know that Martha will take care of you. And in the trunk at the foot of my bed there's money. Enough to get you to Denver, to my old partner, Samuel Crane. He's a good man, and he'd see you were taken care of. Papa, no, listen. I need you to know these things. I need you to be prepared. That's what your mother would have wanted. Emma's good eye filled with tears. I don't want to prepare for losing you. I want you to stay here, stay safe. I know. But sometimes we don't get what we want. Sometimes we just have to face what comes and do the best we can. He kissed her forehead and stood. Rest now. Martha will check on you in a few hours. Lock the door after I leave, and don't open it for anyone but her or me. Where are you going? To have a conversation with the sheriff about how we're going to do this. And Emma, he paused at the door. I love you. More than anything in this world. Everything I do for you. I love you too, Papa. As he stepped out into the afternoon sun, Jacob felt the weight of what was coming settle on his shoulders. He'd promised Mary he'd give their daughter a peaceful life, and he'd tried. God knew he'd tried, but peace sometimes had to be bought with violence, and he was willing to pay that price. He just hoped it wouldn't cost him everything. 2 days passed like a held breath. Jacob checked on Emma every few hours, bringing her soup and water, changing her bandages, watching the bruising spread across her delicate face like storm clouds. She was healing, but slowly, and the physical wounds were nothing compared to what he saw in her eyes. She flinched at sudden sounds now, and she kept asking him to check the door was locked. Violence changed people. Jacob knew that truth better than most. It took something from you that you never got back, a kind of innocence about the world and your place in it. Emma had lost that, and the rage he felt toward the men who'd stolen it from her was a living thing inside his chest, growing stronger with each passing hour. He wore Mary's wedding ring on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. He'd done this since the day she died, keeping her close to his heart, feeling the weight of it against his skin as a reminder of who he'd promised to be. Now, as he sat on his porch in the evening of the second day, he pulled the chain out and held the ring up to catch the fading light. It was simple gold, worn smooth by years of wear, and inside Mary had scratched their initials with a pin, M and J intertwined. He remembered the day he'd given it to her, how his hands had shaken, how certain he'd been that she'd refuse him. But she'd said yes, had smiled that smile that lit up her whole face, and had told him that she saw the man he could be, not the man he'd been. I'm trying to be that man, he whispered to the ring, to her memory. But those men hurt our daughter. They hurt Emma, and I don't know how to be civilized about that. The ring had no answers, but holding it steadied something in him. Mary had always been his moral compass, and even in death she guided him. What would she want him to do? Protect Emma, certainly. But at what cost to his own soul? He heard boots on the path and looked up to see a figure approaching in the twilight. His hand dropped to the knife at his belt before he recognized Martha Henderson, carrying a covered basket. "Evening, Jacob," she called. "Brought some stew for Emma and some fresh bread." "That's kind of you." He stood, taking the basket. "She'll appreciate it." Martha settled onto the porch step with a tired sigh. She was a strong woman, but the tension in town was wearing on everyone. "How's she doing?" "Better. The swelling's going down. Her nose will heal crooked, but she'll heal. And you? How are you doing?" Jacob was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I don't know. You've been sitting out here every night just watching. The whole town's noticed. They're waiting for something to happen. So am I. Martha looked at him in the fading light. I knew your wife, Jacob. Not well, but I knew her. She used to come into the store sometimes, and we'd talk. She was a good woman, and she loved you fiercely, I know. She also told me once that you'd saved her life. Not in some dramatic way, but in a quieter sense. Said you'd been drowning in darkness when you met, and she'd pulled you back to the light. But then she said something I always remembered. She said, "Sometimes the darkness is what keeps the real monsters at bay." Jacob turned to look at her fully. She said that? Word for word. I asked her what she meant, and she just smiled and said that the world needed both kinds of men, the civilized ones and the savage ones, and that you were both. And that was what made you special. He felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. I've been afraid that what I'm planning makes me a monster. Are you planning to hurt innocent people? No. Are you planning to protect your daughter and this town? Yes. Then you're not a monster, Jacob. You're just a father doing what fathers do. She stood, brushed off her skirt. Those 3 men in town. They assaulted a child in broad daylight and laughed about it. They've been terrorizing this town for days. Whatever happens to them, they've brought on themselves. After she left, Jacob went inside and found Emma sitting up in bed, looking stronger. She managed to smile when she saw the basket. Martha brought food, I heard. Emma accepted the bowl of stew he served her. Papa, can I ask you something? Anything. When you were in the mountains, before you met Mama, were you alone the whole time? Jacob settled into the chair beside her bed. Mostly. There were trappers I'd see sometimes, and I'd trade with various tribes. But yes, mostly alone. Weren't you lonely? I was, he admitted. But I was also running from something, and loneliness seemed like a fair price to pay for that. Running from what? From the memory of not being strong enough when it mattered. From the guilt of surviving when my family didn't. From the fear that I'd failed to protect someone again. Emma ate slowly, thinking about this. But then you met Mama, and you weren't lonely anymore. That's right, and now you have me. Now I have you, he agreed. The most precious thing in my life. Then you understand why I'm afraid, she said quietly. Because if something happens to you, I'll be alone. Really alone, and I don't know if I can survive that. Jacob felt his heart break a little. Emma, I mean it, Papa, I need you. Not just because you're my father, but because you're the only person I have. Martha is kind, and the Reverend is nice, and the sheriff tries his best, but they're not family. You're all the family I have left. He moved to sit on the edge of her bed, taking her hand. I know, and that's why I have to do this. Not for revenge, not for pride, but because those men represent a threat. To you, to this town, to any innocence left in this world. If I let them walk away, if I do nothing, then I'm back to being that 16-year-old boy who hid while his family died. I can't be that person anymore. But if you fight them, you might die. Yes, that's not fair. No. Jacob agreed. It's not. But fairness is something we hope for, not something we can count on. The world doesn't owe us safety or justice. We have to fight for those things. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Mama would have known what to say to you. She always knew the right words. She would have told me to be careful, to be smart, to come back to you no matter what. Then do that. Promise me you'll be smart, you'll be careful, and you'll come back. Jacob kissed her forehead. I promise I'll try my very hardest. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Jacob went to the small cemetery at the edge of town. Mary's grave was under a cottonwood tree, marked with a simple wooden cross he'd carved himself. He'd planted wildflowers around it that first spring, the kind she'd loved, and they came back every year like a promise kept. He knelt beside the grave, one hand resting on the earth that covered her. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like thrown diamonds, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. I need your guidance, Mary, he said softly. I need to know I'm doing the right thing. The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves, and in that sound he could almost hear her voice. Mary had been practical, fiercely protective of those she loved, and she'd understood him in ways no one else ever had. "Those men hurt Emma," he continued. "Hurt her bad. And they're not going to stop. I can feel it in my bones. They're planning something worse. The sheriff wants me to help arrest them, make it legal, but we both know how that's going to end." He closed his eyes, remembering. Mary laughing at something he'd said. Mary teaching Emma to read. Mary in the garden with dirt on her hands and joy on her face. Mary dying, fever burning through her, gripping his hand and making him promise to keep their daughter safe. "I promised you I'd protect her," he whispered. "I promised I'd give her a peaceful life. But I can't do both, can I? I can't keep her safe and keep my hands clean. The world doesn't work that way." A memory came to him then, sharp and clear. Emma had been about 7, and they'd been walking in the woods. She'd found a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree, 3 baby birds dead on the ground. She'd cried, and Mary had knelt beside her. "Why did they have to die, Mama?" Emma had asked through her tears, and Mary had said, "Sometimes bad things happen to innocent creatures. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it's part of how the world works. What matters is what we do about it. We can't save these birds, but we can make sure their deaths mean something. We can learn from this, be more careful, protect other nests we find." Then Mary had looked at Jacob over Emma's head, and her eyes had said something more. They'd said, "Sometimes you have to accept that you can't save everyone, but you fight like hell to save the ones you can." Jacob opened his eyes and looked at the cross marking his wife's grave. "I understand now," he said. "You weren't asking me to be passive. You were asking me to be purposeful, to choose my battles and fight them with everything I have." He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "I'm going to stop these men, Mary. I'm going to do whatever it takes. And I'm going to try to come back to our daughter. But if I don't, if the worst happens, I need you to know that I tried. I tried to be the man you believed I could be." As he walked back toward town, Jacob felt a strange clarity settle over him. The internal war he'd been fighting since Emma was hurt had resolved itself. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was protecting his daughter and his community. There was a difference, thin as it might be, and that difference mattered. The town was quiet, most windows dark, but Jacob could see light spilling from the saloon. He moved closer, staying in the shadows, and he could hear voices inside, loud drunk voices. The drifters were still there, still drinking, still acting like they owned the place. He should go home. Should wait for morning, for the sheriff, for the plan they'd discussed. But something made him pause, made him listen. "Going to teach this whole town a lesson." Colt's voice was slurred but vicious. "They think they can disrespect us? Think that mountain man can threaten us? Maybe we should just move on." Billy's voice nervous. "Plenty of other towns. We're not running," Snake interrupted. "We're going to hit that bank like we planned, and then we're going to burn this place to the ground. Starting with that cabin on the edge of town." Jacob's blood went cold. Emma, they were talking about his cabin, about Emma. "The girl first," Colt said, and Jacob heard the smile in his voice. "Let her daddy watch. Then him." Slow. Something snapped inside Jacob. This wasn't about justice anymore, wasn't about protecting the town in some abstract sense. These men were planning to murder his daughter, to make him watch, and they were laughing about it. He turned and walked away before he did something he couldn't take back. But his hands were shaking with rage, and the darkness Mary had civilized out of him was roaring back to life. These men had made their choice. They'd sealed their fate. When he got home, he didn't go inside. Instead, he went to the small shed behind the cabin and pulled up a loose floorboard. Underneath, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a gun belt he hadn't worn in over a decade. The pistol was a Colt .45, well-maintained despite its years of storage, and the leather of the belt was scarred and worn. He lifted it out, feeling the weight of it, the familiarity. Before Mary, he'd worn this gun every day, had used it more times than he wanted to remember. She'd asked him to put it away, to leave that life behind, and he had, for her, for Emma, for the man he wanted to be. But sometimes the man you want to be and the man you need to be aren't the same person. Jacob strapped the gun belt on, adjusting it until it sat right on his hips. Then he drew the pistol, checked the action, and holstered it again. The movement was automatic, muscle memory from another life. He was slower than he'd been at 25, but his hands were still steady, and his eyes were still good. He returned the floorboard to its place and stood there in the dark shed, acknowledging what he'd just done. He'd crossed a line. The peaceful mountain man, who'd tried to leave violence behind, had picked up his gun again. There was no going back from this. Emma would understand. Martha would understand. Even the sheriff in his way would understand. But Mary, would she forgive him for becoming again what she'd worked so hard to redeem? Jacob touched the ring hanging beneath his shirt. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "But they're going to kill her. They're going to kill our baby, and I can't let that happen." "I won't." He went inside quietly, checking on Emma. She was asleep, her breathing steady, her bruised face peaceful in the moonlight coming through the window. He stood watching her for a long moment, memorizing the sight of her, just in case. Then he went to his own room and began to prepare. Not for tomorrow, for tonight, because he'd heard the drifters' plan, and he wasn't going to wait for them to act on it. Sometimes the best defense was a devastating offense, and Jacob Stone had survived alone in the wilderness for years by being the most dangerous thing in the mountains. It was time to remind people what that meant. Jacob moved through the night like a ghost, his years in the wilderness having taught him how to step without sound, how to breathe without presence. He'd left a note for Emma just in case, telling her he loved her and to go to Martha if he didn't return by sunrise. Then he'd slipped out into the darkness with his gun on his hip and murder in his heart. But he didn't go straight to the saloon. He was smarter than that, more patient. Instead, he found a spot in the shadow of the livery stable where he could watch and wait and plan. He pulled a flat stone from his pocket and a piece of charcoal, and by the faint light of the moon, he began to sketch. The map took shape slowly, the main street of Redemption Creek, the buildings, the alleys, the escape routes. He marked the saloon where the drifters were drinking, the bank they planned to rob, his own cabin at the edge of town. He added the surrounding terrain, the creek that gave the town its name, the tree line where the wilderness began. This was something he'd learned in his years alone, a way of thinking through problems that Mary had refined when she taught him to read and write. She'd called it strategic thinking. The Indians he'd traded with had called it counting coup. Jacob just thought of it as staying alive. He studied the drifters' patterns, their habits. Colt was the leader, the most dangerous in a straight fight. Quick with a gun, mean, with enough intelligence to be genuinely threatening. Snake was unpredictable, sadistic, the kind who enjoyed causing pain. Billy was the weak link, following because he lacked the courage to do otherwise. 3 men. Jacob would have preferred better odds, but he'd faced worse. The key was never to let them work together, to isolate and eliminate. It was predator thinking, and some part of him felt guilty for how naturally it came back to him. He heard boots on the boardwalk and pressed deeper into shadow. 2 figures emerged from the saloon, Billy and Snake, walking with the careful steps of men who'd been drinking but weren't quite drunk. They were talking in low voices, and Jacob strained to hear. "Don't like it," Billy was saying. "That mountain man, he's not like other folks. You saw his eyes." "I saw an old man trying to be tough," Snake replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Colt says we take the girl first, make him suffer, and if he comes for us before we get to her, then we kill him." 3 on 1, Billy. Don't be such a coward. They passed within 10 feet of Jacob's hiding spot, and he could have reached out and touched them. His hand moved to his pistol, and for a moment he considered it. Quick, quiet, 2 less problems. But he forced himself to stillness. Not yet. Not until he knew where all the pieces were. The 2 drifters continued down the street toward the boarding house where they'd taken rooms. Jacob waited until they were out of sight, then moved to a new position where he could watch both the saloon and the boarding house. Colt was still inside the saloon. Jacob could see him through the window, sitting at a table with a bottle, cleaning his pistol. The man was methodical about it, and that told Jacob something important. Colt wasn't as drunk as his companions. He was staying sharp, staying ready, smart, dangerous, would have to be handled carefully. Jacob settled in to watch and think. His mind was working through scenarios, possibilities, outcomes. He'd promised Emma he'd be smart, be careful, and he meant to keep that promise. But he'd also heard these men planning to hurt her, and that changed everything. An hour passed, then another. The saloon closed, and Colt finally emerged, weaving slightly but still alert. He paused on the boardwalk, looking up and down the street as if sensing something wrong. For a long moment, he stared directly at the shadows where Jacob hid, and Jacob barely breathed. Then Colt turned and walked toward the boarding house, his hand resting on his pistol grip the whole way. Jacob waited until he was inside, then moved again, circling around to get a better view of the building. It was a two-story structure, and he could see lamplight in 3 windows on the 2nd floor, the drifters' rooms. He made note of which was which, adding this information to his mental map. As he watched, Billy's lamp went out. Then snakes, but Colt's stayed lit, and Jacob could see the shadow of the man moving around inside, pacing. "Can't sleep either," Jacob murmured to himself. "You feel it too, don't you? Know something's coming." He considered his options. Could wait for them to sleep, then handle this quietly. But something Sheriff Garrett had said kept echoing in his mind. Give them a chance to surrender. Make it legal. Jacob didn't want to make it legal. He wanted them dead for threatening his daughter. But Emma's words also echoed, if you're helping protect the whole town, doesn't that make it right? The difference between murder and justice, between revenge and protection, it mattered. It had to matter, or he truly was the monster he feared becoming. He withdrew from his watching spot and made his way to Sheriff Garrett's house. It was well past midnight, but this couldn't wait. He knocked softly but insistently until a lamp lit inside, and the sheriff appeared at the door, gun in hand and sleep in his eyes. "Jacob, what in the—" "They're planning to attack tonight," Jacob said quietly. "Tomorrow at the latest. I heard them talking. They're going to hit the bank, then burn the town, starting with my cabin, with Emma." The sleep cleared from Garrett's eyes instantly. "You're certain?" "I heard them planning it. Every word." The sheriff stepped back, letting Jacob inside. "Then we move now. I'll get my deputy. We'll arrest them tonight while they're expecting trouble." Jacob interrupted. Colt still awake, still armed. "This isn't going to be a quiet arrest." Garrett sat down heavily at his kitchen table, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. "Then what do you suggest?" "We do it at first light. They'll be tired, maybe hungover. We catch them leaving the boarding house, on the street where there's room to maneuver. We give them one chance to surrender, but we go in expecting them to fight. That's not much of a plan. It's the best I've got. Unless you want to wait for them to make the first move, give them the advantage." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, thinking it through. Finally he nodded. "All right. First light. But Jacob, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If they surrender, we take them alive. No matter how much you want them dead, no matter what they've done, if they put down their guns, we take them alive and let the law handle it." Jacob met his eyes. "And if they don't surrender, then you do what you have to do." "But Jacob," Garrett leaned forward, "I know what you're capable of. I don't know how I know, but I do. There's something in you, something controlled but dangerous. If this goes bad, if shooting starts, I need to know you won't lose yourself to it. I'm not planning to lose control. That's not what I asked." Jacob thought of Mary, of the ring around his neck, of Emma sleeping in her bed with her bruised face and frightened eyes. "I'll do what needs doing, Tom, no more, no less. But those men threatened my daughter. If they give me an excuse, any excuse, I'm going to take it." "Fair enough," Garrett said, though he didn't look happy about it. "Go home. Get a few hours sleep if you can. Meet me here an hour before dawn. Bring that gun I see you're wearing, but pray to God we don't have to use them." Jacob left the sheriff's house and made his way back home, moving through the sleeping town like a spirit. The sky was starting to lighten just barely in the east, that deep blue that comes before true dawn. Birds were beginning to stir in the trees. He slipped inside his cabin quietly and checked on Emma. She was still sleeping, and he stood watching her breathe for a while, trying to memorize every detail of her face. If things went wrong in a few hours, this might be the last time he saw her. Then he went to his room and lay down on his bed, still fully dressed, gun belt still on. He didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion pulled him under anyway, and he dreamed. In the dream, he was back in the mountains, tracking a bear that had been raiding his camp. But when he finally found it, the bear had Mary's eyes, and she looked at him with such sadness that he woke with tears on his face. The cabin was still dark. He checked his pocket watch. Another hour until he needed to meet the sheriff. He used the time to write another letter to Emma, longer this time, telling her all the things he should have said years ago. How proud he was of her, how much she reminded him of her mother, how his only regret in life was that he couldn't give her a world without violence in it. He sealed the letter and left it on the table where she'd find it, then checked his pistol one more time. The weight of it was familiar and terrible, a reminder of who he'd been and who he might become again. As he was about to leave, he noticed Emma's blue ribbon on the table, the one that had been torn from her hair during the attack. It was stained with her blood, but he picked it up anyway and tied it around his wrist. A reminder of why he was doing this, of what he was protecting. The sky was grey with approaching dawn when he stepped outside. The air was cool and still, that pregnant quiet before the world wakes up. Somewhere a rooster crowed, and in the distance he heard the first sounds of the town beginning to stir. Jacob Stone walked toward the sheriff's office with purpose in his stride and steel in his spine. Whatever happened in the next few hours would define the rest of his life, or end it. Either way, he was ready. Peter, the deputy, finally appeared, limping, with a gash on his head. "They jumped me," he said miserably. "Came out shooting before I could even call out." "I'm sorry, Sheriff. You're alive. That's what matters." Garrett stood, wincing at the stiffness in his knees. "Jacob, I need you to tell me exactly what happened here." As Jacob recounted the chase, the fight, Emma's near capture, he kept thinking about Colt's last words. "Should have killed you years ago," as if they had history. As if this whole thing had been about more than just random violence, but that didn't make sense. Jacob had been living quietly with Emma for years, and before that, he'd been alone in the mountains. "Unless, Sheriff," Jacob said slowly. "Colt Travers. That name mean anything to you? He was wanted in Colorado." "Why, what for?" Garrett thought about it. "Let me check the wire when we get back." "But I think it was connection to the Travers gang. They were bad men, operated in Colorado about 10 years back. Killed a lot of people. 10 years ago, Colorado, the same place Jacob had met Mary, the same place he'd been before they'd fled into the mountains, the same place he'd been someone else. Emma found it 3 days later while cleaning the small shed behind their cabin. Jacob had told her to rest, to let her injuries heal, but she was restless after being confined to bed, and cleaning gave her something to do with her hands. She was sweeping out the corners when the broom caught on a loose board in the floor. Curious, she knelt and worked the board free. Beneath it was a small space, and inside that space was a leather satchel wrapped in oiled cloth. Her first instinct was to call for her father, but he was in town speaking with the sheriff about the aftermath of the shooting. So she lifted the satchel out, surprised by its weight. Inside, she found things that made no sense. A tin star badge, tarnished but unmistakable. Papers and letters, some official-looking, with seals and signatures. Newspaper clippings yellowed with age. And at the bottom, a photograph of a man who looked like her father but younger, clean-shaven, wearing a badge and standing in front of a building that said U.S. Marshal's Office. Silver Creek, Colorado. Emma's hands trembled as she read through the documents. They told a story she'd never heard, revealed a past her father had hidden from her. The man in the photograph wasn't Jacob Stone, mountain man. He was Jacob Stone Marshall, and according to these papers, he'd been one of the most effective lawmen in Colorado Territory. There were commendations for bravery, reports on criminals apprehended and killed, and then, dated from 10 years ago, a wanted poster for the Travers gang. 5 men who terrorized the territory with robbery, murder, and worse. At the top of the poster, in bold letters, leader, Nathaniel Travers, known associates Frank Gentry, William Keller, Henry Blake, Colt Travers, Colt Travers. The same name as the man her father had killed 3 days ago. Emma kept reading, piecing together a story from fragments. Her father had led a raid on the Travers gang's hideout. 3 gang members had been killed, including Nathaniel Travers. 2 had escaped, Colt Travers and Frank Gentry. There was a note in her father's handwriting. Colt swore revenge. Will keep hunting me. Must disappear. And then, dated 2 months after the raid, a news clipping that made Emma's blood run cold. Schoolteacher murdered in Silver Creek. Mary Stone, wife of U.S. Marshal Jacob Stone, was killed yesterday in an apparent revenge attack. 2 men were seen fleeing the scene. Marshal Stone has disappeared with his infant daughter. Authorities believe he may have gone into hiding to protect the child. Emma sat back, the papers scattered around her, tears streaming down her face. Her mother had been murdered. Not by fever, as her father had always told her, but by men seeking revenge against him. And he'd taken her and run, disappeared into the mountains, become someone else entirely, all to keep her safe. The door to the shed opened, and Jacob stood there, frozen in place when he saw what Emma had found. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he slowly entered and knelt beside her, among the scattered papers of his former life. "You weren't supposed to find these," he said quietly. "You lied to me." Emma's voice was thick with tears. "About Mama, about who you are." "About everything. I protected you," Jacob corrected gently. "There's a difference, is there?" She held up the tin star. "You were a marshal. You hunted down criminals. You killed Colt's brother, and they murdered Mama because of it. And you never told me." Jacob took the badge from her hand, looking at it like it was something poisonous. "I didn't want you to carry that weight. Didn't want you to grow up knowing your mother died because of what I did, because of who I was. So you lied. I gave you a different story, a kinder one. Fever is something that just happens, an act of God or nature. Murder is human evil, and it carries blame and guilt and questions that no child should have to wrestle with." Emma wiped at her tears angrily. "I'm not a child anymore, Papa. You said so yourself." "No," Jacob agreed heavily. "You're not. And maybe it's time you knew the whole truth." He settled onto the floor beside her, and in the dim light of the shed, he told her everything. About his life as a marshal, about tracking down the Travers gang, about the raid that had gone bad and left 3 men dead, including Nathaniel Travers, about how Colt and Frank had escaped and sworn vengeance. "I thought I'd won," Jacob said, his voice distant with memory. "Thought I'd made the territory safer. And I had, in a way. But I'd also made enemies, and they came for what I loved." He described the day Mary died, and his voice broke as he spoke. How he'd been at the marshal's office when it happened. How Frank Gentry had distracted him with a fake tip while Colt went to the schoolhouse. How by the time Jacob had realized it was a trap and raced back, Mary was already gone, stabbed multiple times. And you were crying in the corner covered in her blood, but miraculously unhurt. "They left you alive as a message," Jacob said, "to show me they could have taken you too, that they had power over what I loved. And I knew with absolute certainty that they'd come back for you eventually. So I disappeared, changed how I lived, where I lived, who I was. Became the mountain man instead of the marshal. Buried that tin star and tried to bury everything it represented." Emma was crying freely now, grieving for the mother she barely remembered, for the truth she'd been denied, for the father who'd carried this burden alone for so long. "Colt recognized me," Jacob continued. "Don't know how, but he did. Maybe I looked the same despite the beard and the years. Maybe someone told him where to find me. But that attack on you, Emma, that wasn't random. It was calculated. He hurt you to hurt me, just like they hurt your mother. The whole thing was revenge, 10 years delayed. That's why he said those words," Emma whispered. "Should have killed you years ago." Yes, this was always about finishing what they started. And Jacob's voice hardened. "I gave him exactly what he wanted. I became the marshal again. I killed him just like I killed his brother. Finished the cycle of violence." They sat in silence for a while, both processing the weight of these revelations. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice steadier than before. "Did Mama know? About the danger? She knew I'd made enemies. She knew there was risk. But she loved me anyway, believed in redemption and second chances. She thought we could build a life together, that love was stronger than hate. He laughed bitterly. She was wrong. No, Emma said firmly. She wasn't. Papa, you gave up everything for me. Your career, your identity, your whole life. You hid in the mountains for years to keep me safe. That's what love looks like. Mama wasn't wrong about that. Jacob looked at his daughter, seeing in her Mary's wisdom and strength. You're so much like her. Then maybe I can see what she saw in you. You're not a bad man, Papa. You did what you had to do, both then and now. Those men made choices, evil choices, and you stopped them. That's what marshals do. That's what fathers do. I wanted better for you. Wanted you to grow up, never knowing this kind of violence existed, but it does exist. And hiding from it doesn't make it go away, does it? You tried to hide, tried to be someone else, and it found us anyway. Emma picked up the tin star again, studying it. Maybe trying to be someone you're not was the mistake. Her words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He'd spent 10 years trying to bury Marshal Jacob Stone, trying to become just Jacob the Mountain Man, peaceful and removed from the violence of civilization. But that Marshal was still part of him. Still lived in his skills and instincts and the way he thought through problems. Denying it hadn't made it less true. Martha knew, Emma said suddenly. Didn't she? When you first came to town, she knew who you really were. Jacob nodded. Martha's husband was a deputy marshal before he died. She recognized the badge when I first came into her store, saw it in my satchel before I could hide it. But she kept my secret, understood why I was running. Who else knows? Just Martha. Until now. But after what happened with Colt, after what he said before he died, the sheriff is asking questions. It's only a matter of time before he figures it out. As if summoned by the words, they heard boots approaching the shed. Sheriff Garrett's voice called out, "Jacob, you in there?" "We're here," Jacob replied. Garrett appeared in the doorway, and his eyes immediately went to the scattered papers, the tin star in Emma's hand, the guilty expressions on both their faces. He sighed deeply and removed his hat. Jacob stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful morning street. People were going about their business, merchants opening shops, children playing. All of them potential targets if Frank Gentry decided to make an example. "How many men can you bring?" Jacob asked. "That's the problem. The marshal's office is stretched thin. We've got territorial elections coming up, and most of our men are assigned to protect polling stations and officials. I can maybe get 2 more deputies here by tomorrow evening, but that's it. 3 men, Garrett said. 4 counting me and Jacob, against Frank Gentry and whoever he might have riding with him. Frank usually works alone, Fletcher said. But he's been known to hire guns when he needs them. We have to assume he's not coming alone. Jacob turned from the window. Then we need to prepare. Fort up, get the townspeople ready. Turn Redemption Creek into something Frank can't just ride through. You want to make a stand here? Fletcher asked. That puts civilians at risk. Civilians are already at risk, Jacob countered. Frank knows where I am now. If we leave, if we try to draw him away, he might hit the town anyway, just to send a message. At least if we're here, we can control the situation, protect people. He's right, Garrett said. And this is Jacob's town now. His jurisdiction, his call. Fletcher studied Jacob for a long moment. You're taking the badge, then? Coming out of retirement? I am. Then technically, as a sworn peace officer, you're under federal jurisdiction when it comes to matters like this. I could order you to evacuate your daughter and let the Marshal Service handle Gentry. You could try, Jacob said evenly. But we both know how that would go. A slight smile crossed Fletcher's face. Fair enough. Then I guess we're making a stand in Redemption Creek. He extended his hand. Glad to have you back in the fight, Marshal Stone. Jacob shook his hand, feeling the weight of the title settle on him again. Marshal Stone. Not just Jacob, not just the mountain man, but the full man with all his skills and history. It felt right in a way that surprised him. They spent the rest of the morning planning. Fletcher had experience with defensive positions and coordinating multiple deputies. Jacob had intimate knowledge of the town and the surrounding terrain. Together they began to develop a strategy, First thing is intelligence, Fletcher said, spreading a rough map of the area on the sheriff's desk. We need eyes on every approach to town. If Frank is coming, we need to know from which direction and with how many men. I can handle that, Jacob said. There are 3 main trails into Redemption Creek, plus the wagon road. I'll set watches at each one. Townspeople I trust, who can ride fast if they spot trouble. Good. Second, we need to harden the town. Identify which buildings offer the best fields of fire, which ones are most defensible. We'll position our people where they can cover the main street and the key approaches. The church has a bell tower, Garrett offered. Good vantage point for a rifleman. Perfect. We'll put someone up there with a long rifle. Fletcher made a note. What about the townspeople? How many can shoot? Most of them, Jacob said. This is frontier territory, but shooting prairie dogs is different from shooting at men who shoot back. I'd say maybe a dozen men in town who I'd trust in a fight. Then those are the ones we arm and position. The rest, women, children, elderly, we need to get them somewhere safe. Somewhere Frank can't use them as hostages or leverage. Jacob thought about Emma, about having to tell her that the danger wasn't over, that she'd have to hide again while he faced down yet another ghost from his past. The church has a cellar. It's stone-walled, only one entrance, defensible if it comes to that. We'll fortify it. Put our non-combatants there with guards. Fletcher looked up from his notes. Jacob, I need to ask. Your daughter, will she go willingly? Emma understands what's at stake. She'll go. But that afternoon when Jacob told Emma what was happening, her reaction wasn't what he expected. She was helping Martha in the store when he arrived, her bruises fading to yellow-green, but still visible. When he explained about Frank Gentry, about the need to evacuate her to the church cellar, she set down the bolt of cloth she'd been measuring and looked him straight in the eye. No. Emma, I said no. Papa, I'm not hiding in a cellar while you fight another battle because of me. This isn't because of you. This is because of choices I made 10 years ago. Choices you made protecting people. Choices that were right and good and necessary. Her voice was firm, carrying a strength that reminded him painfully of Mary. And I'm not going to let you face this alone. You won't be alone, Martha interjected gently. He'll have the sheriff and the other marshals. That's not what I mean. Emma turned to her father. Papa, all my life you've protected me. You've given up everything to keep me safe. But I'm not a little girl anymore. I can help. I can load weapons, carry ammunition, tend wounds. I can do something other than hide and wait to see if you come back. Jacob felt his heart breaking and swelling with pride at the same time. Emma, if something happened to you, I'd be alone in the world. Did you think about that? Her eyes were wet, but her voice didn't waver. You keep trying to protect me from everything, including the truth of what our life is. But Mama died because of this, and I almost died because of this, and now you might die because of this. I deserve to be part of it, not shut away like I'm something breakable. Martha put a hand on Jacob's arm. She's right, you know. Mary wouldn't have hidden either. She'd have been right there beside you, doing whatever needed doing. Jacob looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and he saw that Martha was right. Emma had Mary's courage, Mary's determination, Mary's refusal to be sidelined when the people she loved were in danger. He'd been trying to protect her from the world, but maybe what she needed was to face it with him. All right, he said finally, but you stay behind the lines. You help with supplies and wounded, but you don't put yourself in the line of fire. Deal? Deal, Emma agreed immediately. Over the next day and a half, Redemption Creek transformed. Jacob organized the defenses with the precision of his martial days, identifying firing positions and fallback points. The church tower was fortified with sandbags and provisions for a long siege. Windows were barricaded in the buildings along Main Street. Barrels of water were placed strategically in case of fire. The townspeople responded with a determination that surprised even Jacob. These were frontier folk, used to hardship and danger, and they didn't shy from what was coming. Men practiced with their rifles. Women prepared medical supplies and food stores. Even the children helped, filling sandbags and carrying water. Fletcher's 2 additional deputies arrived late the second day, both experienced men who'd faced down outlaws before. With them came news. Frank Gentry had been confirmed heading toward Redemption Creek with at least 4 hired guns. 5 men against their 4 lawmen and dozen armed townspeople. Bad odds, but survivable. Jacob spent that evening going over the plan one more time with his defenders. He stood in the center of the church, surrounded by men and women who'd entrusted their lives and families to his leadership. And he felt the full weight of responsibility that came with the badge now pinned to his shirt. Frank Gentry is coming here for one reason, Jacob told them. Me. He wants revenge for what I did to his gang 10 years ago. If I thought leaving would protect you, I'd ride out right now. But men like Frank don't differentiate between targets and obstacles. If you're in his way, he'll go through you. So we make our stand here together. He pointed to the map they'd drawn. Fletcher and his deputies will hold the north end of town. Sheriff Garrett takes the south. I'll be central, mobile, ready to reinforce wherever we need it. The rest of you will be positioned in these buildings, covering approaches and watching for flanking movements. What if they don't come straight on? Someone asked. What if they try to burn us out? That's why we have water barrels positioned and people assigned to fire watch. Frank's smart, but we're prepared. We know this town, know every alley and building. That's our advantage. Reverend Walsh stepped forward. Jacob, I know I've preached mercy and forgiveness, and I believe in those things. But I also believe in protecting the innocent. You have my rifle and my prayers. Thank you, Reverend. Jacob looked around at all the faces watching him, trusting him. I won't lie to you. Some of us might not survive this. Frank Gentry has killed good men before, and he'll try to kill more. But we have something he doesn't have, something to protect beyond ourselves. We're fighting for our families, our homes, our community. That makes us stronger than any hired gun. After the meeting, Jacob found Emma in the church cellar where medical supplies were being organized. She was rolling bandages with steady hands, her face set in concentration. He sat beside her, and they worked in comfortable silence for a while. Are you scared? Emma asked finally. Yes, Jacob admitted. I'd be a fool not to be. Frank Gentry is one of the most dangerous men I've ever faced. But you'll beat him. I'll try my best. Emma set down her bandages and took her father's scarred hands in her own. Papa, I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about Mama, about how she died because these men couldn't let go of their hate. And I realize something. They're the ones trapped, not you. They've spent 10 years consumed by revenge, and look what it's brought them. Colt is dead and Frank is about to die too. But you built a life. You raised me. You found peace even if it was temporary. You won. Jacob felt tears prick his eyes. I don't feel like I've won. That's because you're still here, still fighting. But when this is over, when Frank is gone, you'll be free. Really free. No more running, no more hiding, no more fear. Just you and me and the life we choose to build. You sound so sure. I am sure. Because I know you, Papa. I know how strong you are, how smart, how determined. And I know you won't let these men take anything else from us. We've lost enough. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, listening to the sounds of the town preparing for battle. And he thought about everything that had led to this moment. Every choice, every sacrifice, every mile he'd traveled to get here. In the morning, Frank Gentry would come, and Jacob would face him. Not as the hiding mountain man, but as Marshal Jacob Stone, the man he'd always been underneath. The man Mary had believed in. The man Emma needed him to be. He reached for the old marshal's coat he'd retrieved from its hiding place, weathered leather riddled with bullet holes from the day Mary died. He'd kept it as a reminder of what he'd lost, but now it felt like armor, like a declaration. Jacob Stone was done running, done hiding, done apologizing for what he was capable of. When Frank Gentry rode into Redemption Creek, he'd find not a frightened fugitive, but a marshal ready to end this once and for all, and God have mercy on anyone who stood in the way. Jacob dropped straight down, his legs folding beneath him in a move that Frank wasn't expecting. Frank's gun, pressed against where Jacob's back had been, discharged into empty air. In that same fluid motion, Jacob twisted his body and brought both pistols up. Firing even as he fell, the shots were instinctive, born from years of training and muscle memory that hadn't faded despite a decade away. His right pistol fired at Frank, catching him in the chest, even as Frank tried to adjust his aim downward. His left pistol fired at the man holding Emma, the bullet striking the man's knife hand and sending the blade spinning away. Jacob hit the ground hard, rolled, came up firing again. Frank staggered backward, blood spreading across his shirt, but he wasn't down yet. The man who'd been holding Emma released her, clutching his ruined hand and screaming. Emma ran, stumbling but moving, getting clear of the line of fire. Frank's gun came up again, but his hands were shaking, blood loss weakening him. He fired twice, both shots going wide. Jacob stood fully now, advancing with both pistols aimed at the man who'd destroyed his family. There was no mercy in his eyes, no hesitation in his step. "This is for Mary," Jacob said, and fired his right pistol. The shot hit Frank's shoulder, spinning him. "This is for Emma." Another shot, hitting Frank's leg and dropping him to his knees. "And this," Jacob stood over Frank now, his pistol aimed at the man's head. "This is for every second of peace you stole from us." Frank looked up at him, blood bubbling at his lips, and he smiled through the pain. "You think killing me ends it? You think this is over?" "There are others. There will always be others. You can't protect her from the world, Stone. You can't—" Jacob's final shot ended Frank's words forever. The man slumped forward into the dust, and 10 years of running, hiding, and fear ended with him. The man who'd held Emma was still alive, writhing on the ground and moaning about his hand. Jacob walked over, kicked away the knife that had threatened his daughter, and stood over him with both pistols trained on his head. "Please," the man begged. "I was just hired muscle. Didn't know what I was getting into. Frank said it was an easy job." "You put a knife to my daughter's throat," Jacob said flatly. "I wasn't going to really hurt her. I swear. I was just supposed to scare." Emma appeared at Jacob's side, her hand touching his arm gently. She was shaking, tears still on her face, but her voice was steady. "Papa, don't." Jacob looked down at her, saw the blue ribbon still tied around his wrist, blood-stained but still there. A reminder of innocence, of the girl he was fighting to protect. Not just her body but her soul, her humanity. "He threatened you," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion. "Put steel against your skin, I know. But he's beaten. Look at him." Emma gestured to the whimpering man. "He's not a threat anymore. And Papa, if you kill him now in cold blood while he's helpless, that makes you like them. Like Frank and Colt. Is that who you want to be?" Jacob's hands were still shaking with adrenaline and rage. Every instinct screamed at him to finish it, to eliminate the threat completely, to make absolutely sure no one ever threatened his daughter again. But Emma's words cut through the red haze. Mary had civilized him once. Emma was doing it again. He lowered his pistols. "Sheriff," he called. "Got a prisoner here, needs tending, and then a cell." Garrett came running, Peter behind him, both looking worse for wear, but alive. They took custody of the wounded man, securing him with rough efficiency born from their own fear and anger. Fletcher climbed down from the church tower, his rifle slung across his back. He surveyed the scene. 5 dead men scattered across the street, including Frank Gentry, the last of the Travers gang. "It's over," he said simply. "They're all dead or captured. You did it, Marshal Stone." But Jacob wasn't listening to accolades. He holstered both pistols and dropped to his knees, pulling Emma into a fierce embrace. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and they stayed like that, both crying, both shaking, both alive. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered. "I'm so sorry, Papa. I should have stayed in the church. I put you in danger." "No," Jacob said firmly, pulling back to look at her face. "No, you have nothing to apologize for. You're alive. That's all that matters. You're alive." He examined her throat where the knife had been, the thin red line that hadn't quite drawn blood. An inch deeper and he would have lost her. The thought made his vision swim, and he pulled her close again, unable to let go. Martha appeared, materializing from wherever she'd taken shelter, and she knelt beside them both. "Let me see her," she said gently, and Jacob reluctantly released Emma into Martha's competent hands. Martha checked the mark on Emma's throat, her face grave but relieved. "She's all right," scared but unharmed. "Emma, you're a brave girl." "I was so scared," Emma admitted. "When that man grabbed me when I heard the gunfire and knew Papa was fighting, I thought—" Her voice broke. But I came, Jacob said. I will always come for you, Emma. Always, no matter what. Fletcher helped Jacob to his feet. That was some shooting, Marshal. Taking down Frank Gentry in a straight fight, most men wouldn't have walked away. Jacob looked at Frank's body, at the pool of blood spreading beneath it, and he felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse, just emptiness. This man had taken Mary from him, had haunted his nightmares for a decade, had tried to kill his daughter twice. And now he was dead, and the world was better for it. How many did we lose? Jacob asked, pulling his mind back to the present. 2 townsmen killed in the initial assault, Garrett reported grimly. 4 wounded, but Martha says they'll live. Both of Fletcher's deputies took injuries, but nothing life-threatening. Could have been much worse. Their names, Jacob said. The men who died. Tell me their names. Thomas Baker and William Reed. Both had families. Jacob closed his eyes. 2 more deaths, 2 more families destroyed by the violence that followed him. I'll speak to their families. Make sure they're taken care of. Jacob, this wasn't your fault, Martha said firmly. Frank Gentry chose this. He chose revenge over peace, violence over healing. He brought this to our town, not you. I brought my past here, my history. And you also brought your skills, your courage, your protection, Reverend Walsh added, emerging from the church with several other townspeople following. Without you, Frank would have done far worse. He would have killed indiscriminately, burned buildings, destroyed families. You stopped him. You saved us. The townspeople were gathering now, emerging from their hiding places, and they were looking at Jacob with a mixture of awe and gratitude. They'd seen him fight, seen him willing to die to protect them, and something had shifted in how they viewed him. 3 cheers for Marshal Stone, someone shouted, and the crowd took up the call. But Jacob raised his hand, stopping them. No, he said quietly. Don't cheer. 2 good men are dead. Their families are grieving. This isn't a victory, it's a tragedy that we survived. If you want to honor anyone, honor Thomas Baker and William Reed. Remember their sacrifice. The crowd quieted, sobered by his words. They began to disperse, some going to tend the wounded, others to comfort the families of the fallen. Jacob watched them go, feeling the weight of the badge on his chest, like an anchor. Emma took his hand. Come home, Papa, please, I just want to go home. Jacob nodded, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind pain and weariness. He ached in places he'd forgotten he had, and his hands were starting to shake in earnest, now that the danger had passed. They walked back to their cabin together, Emma leaning against him for support, Jacob's arm around her shoulders. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, and the evening air was cool and clean after the day's violence and gunpowder smoke. Inside the cabin, everything was exactly as they'd left it. The violence hadn't touched this space, hadn't invaded their home. Jacob lit a lamp, built up the fire, and put water on to boil for tea. Normal actions, domestic actions, the kind of things that reminded him there was more to life than fighting and death. Emma sat at the table, still shaking, and Jacob noticed she'd picked up the blood-stained blue ribbon from his wrist. She was staring at it, turning it over in her hands. I thought I was going to die, she said softly, when that man had the knife against my throat. When I heard Frank telling you to surrender, I thought I was going to die, and you were going to watch it happen. Just like with Mama. Jacob sat beside her, taking one of her hands in his. But you didn't die. You're here. You're safe. Because of you. Because you're faster and smarter and braver than evil men. But, Papa, what if someday you're not? What if someday someone comes who's even more dangerous, and you can't stop them? I can't lose you. I can't be alone. Emma, listen to me, Jacob said, turning her face toward his. You are never going to be alone, even if something happened to me, and I'm not planning on letting that happen. But even if it did, you have Martha, you have the Reverend, you have this whole town that loves you. And you have your mother's strength inside you. You would survive. You would thrive. Because you're not a victim, Emma. You're a survivor. I don't feel like a survivor. That's because surviving isn't about not being scared or hurt. It's about being scared and hurt and choosing to keep going anyway. You did that today. When that man had you, you didn't freeze. You waited for your chance, and when I made my move, you ran. You saved yourself as much as I saved you. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. I want to learn, she said finally. I want you to teach me to shoot, to fight, to protect myself. I don't ever want to be helpless again. Jacob's first instinct was to refuse, to protect her from that world. But he remembered his own parents, how they'd kept him sheltered and how helpless he'd been when violence came to his childhood home. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe the answer wasn't to shield her from danger, but to prepare her for it. All right, he agreed. When you're healed, when things have settled, I'll teach you. Not because I want you to be a fighter, but because you're right. You should know how to protect yourself. They sat together as night fell, drinking tea and slowly coming down from the terror of the day. Outside, Redemption Creek was doing the same. Families reuniting, wounds being tended, stories being told. The town had been tested and had survived, but it was changed. They all were. Eventually, Emma fell asleep at the table, exhausted beyond measure. Jacob carried her to her bed, tucked her in like he had when she was small, and stood watching her breathe in the lamplight. She looked so young, so vulnerable, and yet she'd faced down death today, with more courage than many grown men. She was Mary's daughter, no question. Strong, brave, resilient, and she was his daughter too. Raised by a man who knew violence but chose peace. Who'd killed to protect but never killed for pleasure. Who carried the weight of the badge but never forgot the cost. Jacob pulled out the stopped pocket watch and looked at it one final time. 2:47. The moment Mary died, the moment time stopped. But time hadn't really stopped, had it? Life had continued. Emma had grown. Jacob had changed. And today they'd survived together. He walked outside and stood at the edge of his property, looking toward where Mary's grave lay beneath the cottonwood tree. The moon was rising, casting silver light across the land. It's over, Mary, he said softly. Frank Gentry is dead. The Travers gang is finished. Emma is safe. He paused. I wore the badge again. I became the marshal you civilized out of me. But I also stayed human. Emma reminded me of that, kept me from crossing lines I couldn't come back from. She's so much like you, Mary, so very much like you. The wind rustled through the trees, and in it, Jacob could almost hear Mary's voice telling him she was proud, that he'd done well, that Emma would be all right. I'm going to keep wearing the badge, Jacob continued. Going to be the sheriff here, protect this town, use my skills for good. It's what you wanted, isn't it? For me to find a balance between the savage and the civilized. I think I've finally figured out how. He stood there a while longer, then returned to the cabin. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, families to comfort, bodies to bury, reports to file. But tonight, he would rest beside his daughter's door, keeping watch one more time, making sure she was safe. The marshal had come home. Not to Colorado, not to his old life, but to himself. To the full truth of who he was and what he was capable of. And for the first time in 10 years, Jacob Stone slept peacefully, knowing that the ghosts of his past had finally been laid to rest. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Jacob stood in the town square as Sheriff Tom Garrett pinned the official sheriff's badge to his chest. The old tin star gleamed in the sunlight, fresh and new, representing not who Jacob had been, but who he was becoming. The ceremony was simple, attended by the whole town. Garrett's voice carried across the gathered crowd as he spoke the oath of office, and Jacob repeated the words with steady conviction. When it was done, Garrett shook his hand firmly, his old eyes bright with satisfaction. The town's in good hands, Garrett said. Better hands than mine ever were. I can finally rest easy knowing someone capable is watching over these people. You did well for 30 years, Tom. That's nothing to dismiss. Maybe, but I was ready to be done. You, on the other hand, you're just getting started again. Emma stood in the front row beside Martha, beaming with pride. Her bruises had long since faded, and she'd grown in the past months, not just physically, but in confidence and presence. She still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at sudden loud noises, but she was healing. They both were. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the church hall. Food and conversation, laughter and community. Jacob found himself surrounded by well-wishers, people thanking him for his service, telling him they felt safer knowing he wore the badge. He accepted their gratitude with humble grace, never forgetting the cost of peace. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Jacob stood in the town square as Sheriff Tom Garrett pinned the official sheriff's badge to his chest. The old tin star gleamed in the sunlight, fresh and new, representing not who Jacob had been, but who he was becoming. The ceremony was simple, attended by the whole town. Garrett's voice carried across the gathered crowd as he spoke the oath of office, and Jacob repeated the words with steady conviction. When it was done, Garrett shook his hand firmly, his old eyes bright with satisfaction. "The town's in good hands," Garrett said. "Better hands than mine ever were. I can finally rest easy knowing someone capable is watching over these people. You did well for 30 years, Tom. That's nothing to dismiss. Maybe, but I was ready to be done. You, on the other hand, you're just getting started again." Emma stood in the front row beside Martha, beaming with pride. Her bruises had long since faded, and she'd grown in the past months, not just physically, but in confidence and presence. She still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at sudden loud noises, but she was healing. They both were. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the church hall. Food and conversation, laughter and community. Jacob found himself surrounded by well-wishers, people thanking him for his service, telling him they felt safer knowing he wore the badge. He accepted their gratitude with humble grace, never forgetting the cost of peace. Thomas Baker's widow came to him, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "My Tom died protecting his home," she said quietly. "He died because good men stood against evil. I wanted you to know I don't blame you, Sheriff Stone. I thank you for making sure his death meant something." Jacob took her hands gently. "Your husband was brave. He stood when others might have run. Redemption Creek won't forget him. Neither will I," she said. And there was steel in her voice that reminded Jacob that frontier women were survivors too, strong in ways that didn't require guns or badges. William Reed's family approached next, his son barely 18, and shook Jacob's hand with fierce determination. "Pa would be proud," the young man said. "He always said a man's worth is measured by what he's willing to stand for." As the afternoon wore on, Jacob found himself standing with Deputy Marshal Fletcher, who'd stayed in town to help with the transition and would be leaving the next morning. "You've done good work here," Fletcher said, watching the townspeople celebrate. "Built something real. The Marshal's office in Denver is impressed. They're even talking about making Redemption Creek a regional headquarters, given its strategic location. I'm not interested in expanding operations," Jacob said firmly. "I'm interested in protecting this town. Nothing more." "I figured you'd say that. But Stone, you should know, word's spreading about what happened here, about how you took down the Travers gang single-handedly. There'll be young guns looking to make their reputation, men who'll come testing you. Let them come," Jacob said quietly. "I'm not hiding anymore, and I'm not the same man I was 10 years ago. I'm slower maybe, but I'm smarter. And I have something they don't, something worth protecting." He gestured toward Emma, who was laughing with some other young people, her whole face lit up with joy. She'd started working regularly at Martha's store, had taken on more responsibilities, and was becoming a respected member of the community in her own right. "Your daughter," Fletcher observed. "She's remarkable. Considering what she's been through, she's her mother's daughter," Jacob said with pride. "Mary's strength lives on in her." As evening approached, Jacob excused himself from the gathering and walked alone to the cemetery. He did this once a week now, visiting Mary's grave, talking to her about Emma, about the town, about his life. It brought him peace, helped him feel connected to the woman who'd shaped him. Today, though, he had something special to tell her. He knelt beside the grave, setting down a fresh bouquet of the wildflowers she'd loved. The wooden cross he'd carved had weathered over the years, and he made a mental note to craft a new one before winter. "I did it, Mary," he said softly. "I accepted the badge. I'm Sheriff of Redemption Creek now, officially. And I'm doing it right this time, not running from who I am, but embracing all of it. The peaceful father and the capable lawman. Both are real, Both are me. He pulled out the pocket watch, the one frozen at 2:47, and looked at it in the fading light. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he opened the back and used his knife to carefully adjust the mechanism. It took him several minutes of delicate work, but finally the watch's hands began to move again, ticking forward into the present. "Time to move on," Jacob whispered. "Not forget you, I'll never forget you, but stop living in the moment you died. You wouldn't want that for me, and you especially wouldn't want that for Emma." He stood pocketing the now working watch and noticed someone approaching. Emma walked toward him through the gathering dusk, a shawl around her shoulders against the cooling air. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, settling beside him near the grave. "Just telling your mother about today." Emma smiled. "What did you tell her?" "That I finally figured out what she was trying to teach me all those years ago. That strength comes in many forms. That a man can be gentle and fierce, civilized and savage, a father and a fighter. That those things aren't contradictions, they're complements. She'd be proud of you." "I hope so." "I'm proud of you, Emma. The way you've handled everything, the way you've grown. You're becoming a remarkable young woman." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Finally she spoke. "Papa, I've been thinking about what happened, about who you really are, about all of it. And I realized something. You spent 10 years hiding because you were afraid your past would hurt me. But the truth is, your past is what saved me. If you hadn't been a marshal, hadn't learned how to fight and track and survive, Colt and Frank would have won. Your history isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be grateful for." Jacob felt tears prick his eyes. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from my father. He taught me that surviving isn't weakness, it's strength. That asking for help isn't failing, it's smart. That sometimes you have to do hard things to protect the people you love." She lifted her head and looked at him. "You taught me all of that by being who you are." They walked back to town together as the first stars appeared overhead. The main street was quieter now, the celebration winding down, people heading home to their families. Jacob made his rounds anyway, checking that doors were locked, making sure all was well. It was his job now, his responsibility, and he took it seriously. At the sheriff's office, he found a lamp already lit. Someone had left a fresh pot of coffee brewing, and there was a note on his desk in Tom Garrett's handwriting. "First rule of being sheriff, always have coffee ready. Second rule, trust your instincts. Third rule, protect what matters." You already know all three. "Good luck, Jacob, you'll do fine." Jacob smiled, poured himself a cup and sat at the desk that was now his. The office was small but sturdy, with wanted posters on one wall and a rack of rifles on another. In the corner sat a small cot where he could rest if he needed to stay overnight. It was practical, functional, and somehow it felt right. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing, a letter to the families of the men who died defending Redemption Creek, formally thanking them and establishing a fund to help support them. It was something he could do, a small gesture to honor sacrifice. As he wrote, he heard the door open and looked up to see Emma carrying a basket. "Martha sent dinner. She said sheriffs need to eat too, and you're terrible about taking care of yourself when you're working." "Martha's not wrong," Jacob admitted. Setting aside his pen, they ate together in the office, Emma asking about his duties, Jacob explaining the routine of maintaining law and order. She listened with genuine interest, asking smart questions, and Jacob realized she was studying, learning, preparing herself for a world she now understood could be dangerous. "I've started my lessons," Emma said between bites. "Martha's teaching me to shoot. She said if I'm going to be the sheriff's daughter, I should know how to handle myself." Jacob's first instinct was to object, but he caught himself. Emma had asked for this months ago, had earned the right to learn. "How's she doing?" he asked instead. "She says I have good instincts and steady hands, but she also says I think too much, that I need to trust my body to know what to do." Emma grinned. "Kind of like someone else I know. Your mother used to tell me the same thing. Said I overthought everything. Did you?" "Still do sometimes. But I've learned that thinking and acting don't have to be separate. You can plan carefully and still move decisively when the moment comes. After Emma left, Jacob continued his work going through old files, familiarizing himself with the town's history and ongoing concerns. There was so much he didn't know yet, so much to learn about being a peacetime sheriff rather than a federal marshal chasing outlaws. But he would learn. He would grow into this role the same way he'd grown into being a father, one day at a time, one choice at a time, always trying to do what was right even when it was hard. Near midnight, he finally locked up the office and walked home under a sky full of stars. The night was peaceful, broken only by the sound of crickets and the distant call of an owl. Redemption Creek slept safely, and Jacob Stone stood watch over it. At his cabin, he paused on the porch, looking out over the town he'd come to love. 3 months ago, this had been just a place to hide. Now it was home. These people weren't just neighbors. They were community, family in the truest sense. Inside, he checked on Emma. She was sound asleep, her face peaceful, and then went to his own room. He removed his gun belt, hung it carefully on a peg by the door where he could reach it if needed, and prepared for bed. Before sleeping, he pulled out the pocket watch one last time. It was ticking steadily now, moving forward, marking time that wasn't frozen in grief. He wound it carefully, making sure it would keep running, and set it on the table beside his bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be disputes to settle, laws to enforce, and perhaps someday another threat to face. But Jacob was ready, not because he was fearless, he wasn't, but because he'd finally accepted all of who he was, had integrated the marshal and the mountain man, the savage and the civilized, the past and the present. He was Jacob Stone, sheriff of Redemption Creek, father to Emma, widower of Mary, former marshal, mountain man, protector. He was all of these things, and he was finally at peace with that truth as he drifted off to sleep. His last thought was of Mary, of her smile and her belief in him, and he whispered into the darkness, "Thank you for everything, for Emma, for believing I could be more than my worst moments, for loving me enough to show me the way." The wind outside his window seemed to carry an answer, a whisper that might have been his imagination or might have been something more. "I always knew who you really were. I'm glad you finally see it too." And in the morning, when Jacob Stone woke to another day of life in Redemption Creek, he would put on his badge and walk the streets he'd sworn to protect. He would be there when people needed help, when justice needed serving, when the weak needed protecting from the strong. He would be exactly what Redemption Creek needed him to be. He would be home, and that, finally, was enough.